My name is Jeff O'Brien. I'm the City of Saskatoon archivist, and I'd like to say thank you to the Saskatoon Open Door Society for inviting me here today to participate in Threads. And I'm going to talk today about immigration in Saskatchewan, and the title of my talk is Strangers at Our Gates. So in Saskatchewan, we like to think of ourselves as having embraced the newcomer with open arms. Our provincial motto even says that. It says, "From many people's strength." But the truth is that the welcome that we have given to the strangers knocking at our gate has often been quite muted. And the stranger they got, meaning the more they deviated from being white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, the more reluctant we became. In fact, a more historically accurate motto for Saskatchewan might be that of the Bar colonists who came here in 1903 under the banner of Canada for the British. So what I want to do today is look at immigration to Saskatchewan, and in particular to Saskatoon, up to about 1930, and talk about the way that people living here welcomed, or did not welcome, newcomers. So the first European arrivals here were not immigrants, they were visitors. And they were here specifically because of the fur trade. And while the fur trade itself had a huge impact on the people living here, the European presence itself was limited. But by 1870, the collapsing bison population, the introduction of new diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis were proving catastrophic to the people of the plains, destroying not only their traditional lifestyle, but imperiling their very survival. Meanwhile, the new Dominion of Canada was determined to assert its control over the northern prairies, and that meant settlers on the ground. So initially, the flood of new settlers was more like a trickle. But even if the numbers were small at first, settlers did come. And you want to talk about strangers at people's gates. Try to imagine the reaction of the First Nations people living here to this influx of newcomers with their strange clothes and their weird customs and their odd names. They couldn't even speak the language, for crying out loud. And of course, they were completely unprepared for life on the prairies. So one of the recurring themes I'm going to look at is this idea that newcomers to Saskatchewan posed a threat to our essential Britishness. Now, we don't worry so much about that nowadays, not in those specific terms anyway. But 100 years ago, it was a pretty big deal. And I'll talk about this at some length later on. But I'm going to get a little ahead of myself right now and suggest that the only people in these parts who ever needed to worry about their culture and way of life being overwhelmed by a rising tide of immigration were the Métis and First Nations. Everyone else, not so much. Getting back to the 1880s. Saskatoon, our beautiful Saskatoon, was founded in 1883 by a group known as the Temperance Colonization Society. The relationship between Saskatoon and its nearest neighbor, what's now the Whitecap First Nation, was for the most part fairly amicable. Chief Whitecap even helped to pick out the location for Saskatoon. There's a big statue on the riverbank all about that. And both communities recognized the mutual benefits of having each other as neighbors. But there was also tensions. The people here, the First Nation and Métis, they got to watch the world they knew being disassembled, basically, by these newcomers, while their own grievances were more or less completely ignored by the government in Ottawa. And I don't think it should have come to a surprise as anyone in 1885 when these grievances boiled over into open warfare. And I realize that I'm taking a very complex situation and I'm simplifying it horribly. We could talk for really hours, days about the causes and consequences of the Northwest resistance and still not cover everything. But what I've given you here is a fairly reasonable summary. The temperance colony settlers who came to Saskatoon in the 1880s were a very homogeneous lot, mostly Ontario English Protestants, mostly Methodists, some Presbyterians. The two notable exceptions were the Cush family, who came with the first party of settlers in the spring of 1883 and who were German and Catholic, and Louis Goujon, a French-Canadian who came here in 1884. But exceptions like this, like the Cushes and Goujon, were rare. In the 1890s, for example, immigration agents refused entry to Mennonites, Ukrainians, and Doukhobors looking to settle here on the grounds that the Saskatoon district was reserved for English-speaking settlers, which was not true. When people talk about the original Saskatoon temperance colony, they're usually thinking about the area around Broadway in what's now Newtana. But Saskatoon originally was intended as an agricultural community. If you came here to Saskatoon back in those days, 1880s, 1890s, it was with the expectation that you'd buy your quarter section of land and you'd farm it. And so Saskatoon is this huge area stretching on both sides of the river from Clark's Crossing south to Whitecap. But the colony actually only got title to every second section of land within this area. And that meant that half of the land in Saskatoon was open to be settled by anybody who could come up with the $10 application fee, whether they were English speaking or not. Nevertheless, these non-English settlers were kept out. So instead, they settled in places like Rossern and Blaine Lake, and so Saskatoon's sacred British character was successfully preserved that time. It wasn't until the turn of the century that European settlement really took off here, and it was thanks to Clifford Sifton, Federal Minister of the Interior, in 1896, who opened the taps of Western immigration full blast. Immigration to Saskatoon and Saskatchewan boomed. We were the last best west, as they like to call us, and immigrants poured in from all over. The population of Saskatchewan went from 41,000 in 1891 to 260,000 in 1906, and almost 500,000 by 1911. Saskatoon went from a few dozen people in 1891 to 4,500 in 1906, and nearly all of that growth happened in the last 3 or 4 years of that period. By 1911, the population had doubled. There were 12,000 people living here, and by the end of 1912, just over a year later, that number is a staggering 28,000 people. Imagine that there were 650,000 people living in Saskatoon this time next year. That's what 1912 was like, an immense change in an impossibly short time. So provincially, Sifton's goal had been to get farmers on the land, and in this he was successful. In 1906, 80% of the people living in Saskatchewan were rural. But who were they? Well, I'll tell you, mostly they were white and Anglo-Saxon, or at least Western and Northern European, and overwhelmingly Protestant. That religion accounting for 74% of all people living in Saskatchewan in 1911. But Sifton's greatest success may have been in drawing immigrants from the central and eastern parts of continental Europe. These are the stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats that he referred to. Ukrainians, Russians, other Slavic peoples who came here to work the land and to satisfy the country's insatiable need for cheap labor. So the three largest ethnic groups in Saskatchewan in 1911 were the British, at just over half, Germans at 14%, and right behind them at 13.4%, the various Slavic people, these Doukhobors and Mennonites and Russians and Ukrainians. And 3/4 of them were recent immigrants, and that makes them a substantial and very visible minority. And I should explain this because it might not be obvious to a modern audience just how visible a minority people like this were. So when I was working on this, I asked my son, I said, "Are there any Ukrainians in your class at school?" And he looks at me and says, "How the hell would I know?" Well, I'll tell you something. In 1911, you absolutely would have known. And I'll get to this more in a minute, but they were in all ways immediately identifiable. So much so that people here despaired that they could be anything other than foreign. But we desperately needed them, and so they came by the tens of thousands. But there were others who we did not want, for any reason. Blacks, Asians, Jews especially, were actively discouraged from coming here. Americans were in high demand. American farmers tended to have money, they had their own farming equipment, and they already had experience in dryland farming practices, and these were all critical to success in farming here. But white Americans only. Immigration agents were told not to advertise in black communities, and as much as possible to discourage blacks from coming, for example, by playing up the harshness of our cold northern climate. Southern Europeans were similarly unwelcome. Italians, in particular, were labeled as hopelessly incapable. I have no idea why. Some of this comes down to, or at least was justified by, the desire to recruit agriculturalists only. We needed farm workers. That's where the labor shortage was. And people from certain groups, it was felt, would naturally gravitate toward the cities, where instead of helping to alleviate the labor shortage, they would add to it. And there's some truth in this. The 1926 Prairie Census showed that the overwhelming majority of people who gave their racial origin as Jewish, Chinese, and Greek, for example, lived in cities. We're talking in the 80 to 90% range. On the other hand, the Slavic peoples tended to stay on the land, on the farm, which is where we wanted them. So regardless of the reasons, the census figure clearly showed just how effectively people of color and other non-preferred ethnicities were discouraged from coming here. In the 1911 provincial census, under the heading Racial Origins, Southern Europeans, Italians and Greeks specifically, combined make up 0.07% of the population, 0.07%. Blacks are further 0.07%, Middle Easterners 0.04%, Chinese 0.2%, and Hebrews, as the census calls them, the far and away front runners with a whopping 0.4%. So this is most of the world we're talking about here, and it's represented in Saskatchewan by less than 1% of the population. And that doesn't get any better. In the 1931 census, the numbers are marginally higher, but still minuscule. Now in the cities, while the number of Central and Eastern Europeans is lower than in rural areas, the majority of them are single men. In 1911, in Saskatoon, for example, the ratio of men to women overall was 1.7 to 1. And you'd expect this in a place that was really, in a lot of ways, still a frontier town. But the numbers are vastly out of proportion when you look at the Slavic population. So there we're talking in the range of 20 to 1 male to female. And for Chinese immigrants, the ratio in 1911 was 82 to 0. That's 82 men, no women. Economically, non-English speaking immigrants tended to drift to the bottom of the ladder. Saskatoon's big boom spiked in the years from 1909 to 1912. And it was a good time for the city generally, but the high prices and the high rents made life nearly impossible for those at the bottom. So wages for laborers were grossly inadequate anyway, and non-English speaking immigrants lived at the low end of the low end. And when you're swinging a pick at $2 a day and rent is $20 to $30 a month, it doesn't leave a lot left over. And their living conditions reflected that. You also don't have to look too far to find evidence of pushback against these types of newcomers. So English, American, German, Scandinavians, we welcome those people with open arms. But these strangers, with their strange clothes and customs, their odd names, their unintelligible language, and of course, no experience with life on the prairies, these ones provoked some very strong reactions, most acutely for fear that by their very alienness, these strangers within our gates, as J.S. Wordsworth called them, threatened our Anglo-Canadian identity. In the words of Bill Wazer, whose book Saskatchewan, A New History I highly recommend, immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe were associated in the popular imagination with poverty, crime, ignorance, and immorality. In 1913, a certain Reverend B.W. Pullinger, while preaching a sermon about the evils of low wages for workers and about the greed of employers, took a moment to blame foreign laborers for their poverty. He said, "We cannot expect the folks from Galatia and Russia to understand what a fair day's work or a fair wage is, because they content themselves in rolling around in filth and doing many other things degrading to human nature. They live on nothing, their meals generally consisting of a morsel of bread and a cup of water, and you are able to smell them all over Saskatoon." So the labor movement itself, supposedly the champion of the working man, was frequently virulently anti-immigrant. Grievances during a strike by men digging sewers here in 1909, for example, included things like terrible wages, unsafe working conditions, a lack of sanitary facilities on the job sites, and, oh my God, having to work with non-English speaking laborers. Labor leaders also complained that foreigners threatened their wages and their jobs. In 1913, the Saskatoon Trades and Labor Council wrote a letter to Saskatoon City Council noting that today, foreign laborers in this city are forced by economic conditions to herd into ill-ventilated shacks. And we hope for better things for our English-speaking worker than a dog kennel at night and a dinner of dry bread and raw turnip, which is all some foreigners in this city are getting today. Or, you know, you could push for higher wages for everyone, but apparently they didn't think that way in 1913. The declaration of war against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914 just made things worse. When a German submarine sank an American passenger liner in 1915, a rumor spread through Saskatoon that the German workers at a local brewery had held a private dinner party to celebrate it. People were outraged. The mayor of Saskatoon got up and he called for the immediate internment of all enemy aliens, Germans and Ukrainians in Saskatchewan. Given that these two groups made up a quarter of the population, more than 100,000 people, this would have been a little awkward to try and manage. But there were internments during the war, although the reasons for them were at least as much about politics and resources as they were about race and national security. So many of the Central Europeans who'd come to Saskatchewan before the First World War were single men, brought here to work as construction laborers. We might call them temporary foreign workers today. When the economy collapsed in 1913, they were the first to be laid off. And then when war broke out in 1914, the rest were laid off. And so naturally, they headed for the cities looking for work. And there's nothing like having a great big gang of destitute, unemployed men hanging around to make the authorities nervous. This is especially true when they're foreigners, and even more true when, like these unemployed Ukrainian laborers, they're mostly citizens of a power with whom you're at war. So in the fall of 1914, under the War Measures Act, all Ukrainians and Germans living in or near a city were required to register, and the Canadian government promptly began rounding them up and sending them to internment camps, starting with these unemployed workers. The vast majority of the internees were Ukrainian. Nearly all of those were these single men I've been talking about. Of the 8,000 or so interned during the First World War, only a handful were women and children. So although it comes down to, in the end, to race and citizenship, one of the issues was the inability of local authorities to cope financially with large numbers of unemployed under a system in which all social services were administered and paid for locally. The same thing happened during the 1930s when single unemployed men were herded into concentration camps for exactly the same reasons: money and the fear of political instability. Still, the war caused an additional hardening of attitudes towards these immigrants. As Bill Wazer said, people couldn't comprehend, let alone appreciate, how immigrants could hold multiple loyalties, keeping their language, religion, and culture while developing into Canadian citizens. And this was a problem. Another immigrant community that saw pushback here, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada generally, were the Chinese. Although Chinese laborers had been imported in droves to build the railway in the 1880s, they were not welcomed as permanent residents. And one of the strategies for getting rid of them was to impose a steep head tax, which was done from 1885 to 1923. The Chinese were the only group of immigrants this happened to, and the result, as we saw, was that in the 1911 census, there are 82 Chinese men in Saskatoon and no women. In 1916, a year when Saskatoon was otherwise evenly split between men and women, in the Chinese community, it was 154 to 1. But apparently that wasn't strict enough. And from 1923 to 1947, immigration from China was suspended altogether, including ethnic Chinese with British citizenship. Otherwise, if you were British, automatically you could come to Canada, or at least automatically you could get Canadian citizenship. But if you were a Chinese with British citizenship, forget it. Locally, we also saw repressive legislation like the Provincial Female Employment Act of 1912, which forbade white women from working at, lodging in, or frequenting any place of business owned by any Oriental person. Now, partly this was a response to the white slavery panic, as they called it, which was going around at the time, very popular in North America, and which alleged that innocent white girls were being lured into lives of prostitution and debauchery by secret cartels of depraved foreigners, mostly Asian men, and often using ice cream parlors as a front for their nefarious schemes. Girls were warned to stay out of ice cream parlors because of this. But there was also pressure from business and labor groups who were trying to stifle the competition. Chinese businesses depended on English-speaking staff to run their front counters and interact with their overwhelmingly English-speaking customers. So legislation like this would have made things quite difficult for these Chinese-owned businesses, and that would have undercut their competitiveness. So I've got a couple letters here written by a Lloydminster shopkeeper in 1923 that I'd like to read that I think are rather illuminating. He writes, "It seems almost incredible that any government would allow these yellow men into the country at any price, or if allowed at all. Why do they pick out the very class that are putting the retailers out of business all over the West? These confounded Chinese people," he actually uses a different word, which I'm not going to say. "These confounded Chinese people are running restaurants and selling groceries at all hours of the day and night, and the burden of them is almost intolerable." It wasn't just the Chinese he was down on. In another letter he says, "We want lots and lots of immigration to this country, but why in the name of all the saints do they want to let in more Orientals and Jews and Southern Europeans? There are enough of fine Britishers and Scandinavians to supply all our needs in building up this country without resorting to the low types. To think that our federal government will even contemplate for one moment the idea of allowing a lot of Russian Jews to come here is too awful to contemplate." Awful. The man who wrote this, was a respected small businessman, a solid, upstanding member of his church and his community. He ran a general store in Lloydminster, dry goods, groceries, clothing, that kind of thing. The time when he's writing, 1923, immigration to Saskatchewan, which had plummeted during the war, was only just starting to pick up again. So he's right when he says we needed lots and lots of immigrants. What he didn't want was for them to come open up a store across the road from him. In 1919, the Canadian government passed legislation allowing it to prohibit immigration to Canada based on race, nationality, occupation, and class. So prospective immigrants were listed in order of preference, with the British and Americans at the top, and Jews, Asians, Gypsies, and black people at the very bottom. And in this, Canada was heir to a British imperial worldview which made absolutely no secret about how it ranked the peoples of the world, with the British race firmly placed at the pinnacle. But at the same time, in the 1920s, there's a huge push for immigration to Canada. And this is coming not just from authorities here in Canada, but also from abroad. For example, the British Empire Settlement Plan, which was an attempt by Great Britain to ship all its unemployed people off to the colonies, which Canada, of course, was having nothing to do with. In fact, simply being British wasn't a guarantee of coming to Canada. The British government had this idea that Canada would make a great dumping ground for its urban poor. And so in response, Canada passed legislation in 1905 and again in 1910 specifically to exclude these sorts of people, many of whom were seen, rightly or wrongly, as little more than criminals. So by the mid-1920s, Western Canada was again suffering a labor shortage that wasn't being met by immigrants from the preferred countries. And so under a 1925 agreement, companies began again bringing in Eastern and Central Europeans. Nearly 200,000 of them came to the West, a great many of them to Saskatchewan. And as a result, by the end of the 1920s, Saskatchewan had the highest population in Canada and was the most ethnically diverse province in the Dominion. But what that meant to people living here was that our hallowed Britishness was once again under attack. Leading the defense against this were people like George Exton Lloyd, the Anglican bishop of the Diocese of Saskatchewan. Fearing that this flood of ignorant, garlic-smelling continentals, as he liked to call them, would do irreparable harm to our cherished Canadian values, Lloyd mounted a ferocious campaign against non-British immigrants, warning that if it went on, Canada would soon become a mongrel nation. The real question, he declared, is not whether these people can grow potatoes, but would you want your daughter to marry one? In 1928 alone, Bishop Lloyd is reported to have written 70,000 letters on this subject. 70,000. That's 191 letters per day, every day. I don't even know how that's possible. He also did speaking tours at the same time on the subject of immigration. So he was a very busy boy in 1928. Another voice that took up the anti-immigrant call in the late 1920s was the Ku Klux Klan, which came to Saskatchewan waving the flag of British Protestantism and against Jews, immigrants, and Roman Catholics. The KK message resonated in Saskatchewan. At its height in 1929, there were 25,000 paid-up members here. Just by way of comparison, the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association, an immensely politically influential body in the 1920s, only had 35,000 members at its height. The KKK held a cross-burning ceremony in Moose Jaw in 1927, which attracted thousands of people, including hundreds who came by special train from Regina. And in 1929, Saskatoon hosted a two-day conference that brought in 300 delegates from across the province. So for a little while anyway, the KKK did very well in Saskatchewan. So all of this stuff happened a long time ago. And it's tempting to think that Saskatchewan has changed since then, as it surely has. The demographic landscape here today would have horrified Reverend Pullinger in 1913 or Bishop Lloyd in 1928. Demographically, Saskatchewan is hugely different from what it was even a generation ago, and that's not going to change. Anyone who yearns for a return to some mythic good old days of British whiteness here in Saskatchewan has been living under a rock for the last 50 years. To our modern sensibilities, a lot of what I've talked about here isn't just unacceptable, it's ridiculous. The Female Labor Act of 1912 or the KKK running around in bed sheets and talking about the Roman Catholic menace. Seriously, you read this kind of thing and it's hard to even imagine. But this kind of thinking is a trap. It's an easy way out, a way for people living here now to let themselves off the hook. The past is filled with so many examples of people behaving badly that when you look at it, it's pretty easy to get all smug about how far we've come here in these modern times with our modern sensibilities. I want to think that in Saskatchewan we have changed for the better since 1914 or 1928, not just as individuals, but as a society. But I can tell you, as an archivist, I've spent my career surrounded by the voices of the past. And if there's one thing those voices have taught me, it's that sometimes the past is a mirror. And sometimes when we look into the pages of history, the face we see staring back up at us is our own. Thank you very much.